Tonight on the Midnight Drive, long before Oregon was a state, it was a direction. West. A word that lived on worn paper maps and letters sent home and in conversations held around kitchen tables by people wondering if there might be something better just beyond the horizon. There wasn't an interstate, there wasn't a railroad, and for much of the journey there wasn't even a road. Just wagon ruts stretching across open prairie. River crossings that could change a family's future in a single afternoon. Campfires beneath skies so dark that the stars seemed close enough to touch. And somewhere, far beyond the next ridge, the Willamette Valley. Now, if you're anything like me, the first time you ever heard the words the Oregon Trail wasn't from a history teacher. It was in a school computer lab. A black screen, bright green letters, a covered wagon inching its way west. Every few minutes, someone in the class died of dysentery. Somehow, we all laughed. Looking back, it's remarkable that a little computer game introduced so many of us to one of the most extraordinary journeys in American history. Because behind those pixelated wagons were real families, real children, real fears, and real hope. Tonight, we're joining them, just for a little while. Now, every journey has a moment before it begins. The suitcase sitting by the front door. The final walk through an empty house. One last look out the kitchen window. You stand there for a second longer than you expected. Not because you've forgotten something, but because you know things won't look quite the same when you come back. If you come back. I imagine the families preparing for the Oregon Trail felt something similar. Only, their journey wasn't measured in days, it would be measured in months. Imagine standing in your front yard sometime in the early 1840s. Everything you own has been laid out in neat piles in front of you. A cast iron skillet, a family Bible, blankets, a sewing kit, a coffee pot that's been used every morning for years and years and years. A few changes of clothes, flour, beans, tools, every item has earned its place. Not because someone told you what to pick, but because every pound matters. Take too much, and the wagon becomes heavier than the oxen can comfortably pull. Take too little, and you may find yourself wishing you had made different choices hundreds of miles from home. It's a strange exercise, looking at your entire life and deciding what deserves to make the trip. Some things stay behind, not because they aren't loved, but because they simply won't fit. A favorite rocking chair, the heavy dining table where birthdays were celebrated, the clock that hung in the hallway for years. Books, keepsakes, little reminders of ordinary life. One by one, they remain where they are. You don't throw them away, you just simply whisper to yourself, someone else will use them. Long before anyone crossed a river or climbed a mountain, the Oregon Trail had already begun. It began with letting go. By the middle of the 19th century, thousands of families had made the extraordinary decision to head west, drawn by stories of fertile farmland, new opportunities, and the promise of building a life in places many of them had never seen with their own eyes. For many, the Willamette Valley represented that promise, a destination described in letters, newspaper articles, and conversations carried from one community to another. Think about that for a minute. Most of these travelers had never seen Oregon. There's no photographs, there's no documentaries, there's no satellite images. They're just stories. Someone's cousin had written home. A neighbor knew a family who'd made the trip. A newspaper described rich soil and broad valleys. The picture formed in your mind, little by little. Not unlike stories we've talked about all week. One conversation at a time. Eventually, the decision was made. The wagon was loaded up. Neighbors gathered to say goodbye. I wonder what those conversations sounded like. Write when you can. Be careful crossing the rivers. We'll see you again someday. Maybe they believed it. Maybe they didn't. The children probably understood the journey differently. To them, it might have felt like an adventure. Sleeping beneath the stars, crossing rivers, seeing buffalo for the first time. The adults were carrying something much heavier. Not just supplies, responsibility. Every single decision mattered. Every river crossing, every storm, every choice about when to stop or when to push forward. Some evenings, I imagine the excitement gave way to quiet. After the children had fallen asleep, after the campfire had burned low, someone would unfold the map. A finger traced a line stretching west. Not to where they were, but to where they hoped to be. The Willamette Valley in Oregon. Still impossibly far away. And then morning came. The fire was stirred back to life. Breakfast was cooked. The oxen were harnessed. The wheels creaked. And with a gentle pull on the reins, something remarkable happened. A life that had existed in one place began moving toward another. One slow turn of the wagon wheel. Then another, and then another. The distance covered that first day probably wasn't too impressive. Maybe 15 miles, maybe less. By today's standards, hardly anything at all. But I have a feeling that first evening felt different than all the others. Home was no longer behind the next hill. It was already disappearing behind the horizon. What a strange feeling to know that you've gone too far to turn around and not nearly far enough to arrive. As I thought about those first few days on the trail, I realized they weren't really traveling toward Oregon yet. They were learning how to travel, how to live outdoors, how to solve problems with whatever they had packed. How to trust strangers around the evening fire, how to wake up and keep moving, even when the destination still felt unimaginably far away. It's easy to remember the Oregon Trail as a series of dramatic moments. The river crossings, the mountain passes, the broken wagon wheels, the illnesses we learned about in the computer game. Now, those moments certainly happened, but they weren't every day. Most days looked remarkably similar and almost became dull. The sun came up, breakfast was cooked, the fire was put out carefully, the oxen were harnessed, someone checked the wagon one more time, then the wheels began turning again. Now, if you traveled with a wagon train, life quickly settled into a rhythm. Most days covered somewhere between 10 and 20 miles, depending on the terrain, the weather, and the condition of the animals. It wasn't fast by modern standards, but speed was never really the goal. Reaching Oregon safely. That was the goal. I tried imagining what that would feel like, not for one afternoon, but for 5 months. Walking beside the same wagon, watching the same wheels turn, listening to leather creak against wood. Dust settling on your boots every single day. Eventually, the extraordinary must have started feeling very ordinary, like I said before, if not completely dull. After the break, we're going to keep moving forward on the Oregon Trail. I'd love to hear your comments wherever you might be listening. Did you play the game? What version did you play? Personally, I played the color version on an old Macintosh computer. Before that, we had the black screen and the green letters. You're listening to The Midnight Drive. After days on the road, can you imagine the first time that you encounter grassland? Such a strange thing to think about, right? You've been traveling and traveling and traveling and traveling, and then all of a sudden, grassland for as far as you can see. What do you think that you and your family would do? Well, you'd probably stop, take it all in, point toward the horizon, and then get back in your wagon and you travel some more. Day after day after day after day. And a week later, the prairie is still there. You stop pointing because it just simply becomes home for now. The Oregon Trail wasn't really one journey. Think about that. It was thousands of tiny routines stitched together. Everybody had small responsibilities. Someone gathered the firewood. Someone mended a shirt. Someone walked beside a stubborn ox that refused to cooperate. Someone taught a child how to identify constellations while lying beside the evening fire. Someone had to go out and hunt. Life didn't pause because people were traveling. Life simply traveled with them. Meals still needed cooking. Children would become upset. They still needed comforting. Boots would get worn and still needed repairing. The people still laughed. The people still cried. I think sometimes we forget that. History has a habit of preserving extraordinary moments. It rarely writes down the mundane things, like who made breakfast, or who remembered to bring the extra thread, or who stayed awake a little longer because someone else's child had a fever. But those quiet acts, those small acts, those seemingly insignificant acts probably filled far more hours than the famous landmarks ever did. And then there were the rivers. If the prairie taught these travelers patience, the rivers demanded the travelers courage. The trail crossed hundreds of streams and dozens of major rivers. Some could be forded safely. Others required ferries. Occasionally, travelers unloaded wagons, waterproofed what they could, and trusted both current and preparation to carry them across. A crossing that looked calm from shore could become very dangerous in a matter of minutes, or even a matter of seconds. I wonder how long people stood on the bank, staring at the river, before making the decision. Not because they didn't know what to do, but because once the wagon entered the water, there wasn't much room for second thoughts. Do you think one person made the decision? Do you think it was a group majority vote? It's a big decision to cross one river or one stream, let alone several. Just think about it for just a moment. Imagine someone tightening a rope one last time. Another person quietly checking that the children were sitting still. Someone looking downstream, wondering if the current looked stronger than it had a few moments ago. Then, a nod. The oxen stepped forward, water climbed the wagon wheels, and everybody held their breath to see what would happen next. Eventually, the opposite shore. Not met with cheers, but certainly met with extreme relief. One huge obstacle behind them, and countless more ahead. See, the trail had a way of teaching people not to celebrate too early, because tomorrow would bring another challenge. It would bring another decision. It might bring another river. And through it all, they kept finding a way through. In the midst of the tense moments, there were lighter moments too. Children racing one another across open stretches of prairie. Evenings that were filled with music from a fiddle that somehow survived the journey. Stories shared around the campfire by people who had been strangers just a few weeks earlier. And I like to think that those evenings mattered just as much as the difficult ones did. Not because they erased the hardship of the situation that everybody was sharing, but because they reminded the people why they were making the trip in the first place. So I pondered about all of those long months on the trail. I found myself realizing something wonderfully ordinary. Laundry. Imagine washing clothes halfway across the continent. Imagine trying to keep a wagon organized while living out of it for literally months. Imagine discovering halfway through dinner that someone forgot the coffee pot 3 campsites back. Those aren't the stories we usually tell, but I suspect they're the ones that made the trail feel real. Because life has a way of insisting on being lived. No irony, that's life, man. Even in extraordinary circumstances, I caught myself thinking about the old computer game again. In the game, every few minutes, something happened. A snake bite, a broken axle, dysentery, a hunting trip. The pace made sense. Games need constant decisions. Real life does not. Real life is much slower. Real life is walking beside a wagon for hours while listening to the wind move through tall grass. It's repairing the same harness for the 3rd time that month. It's watching the horizon all afternoon and realizing it never seems to get any closer. And yet, every evening when the wagon circled and another fire was lit, the Willamette Valley was one day nearer than it had been that morning. Not close enough to see by any stretch of the imagination, but it was closer than yesterday. After the break, I'd like to spend some time with something the travelers themselves never could have imagined. How their journey stopped being a trail and slowly became one of America's most enduring stories. This is The Midnight Drive. Somewhere along the way, the Oregon Trail stopped being just a trail, and it became a story. That probably happened so gradually that nobody on the trail even noticed. The first families arrived. They built homes. They started farms. They raised children. Years passed. Then one evening, someone pointed toward the old wagon sitting behind the barn and said, "Let me tell you how we got here." That's usually how stories begin. Not in history books, not in museums, but around dinner tables, on front porches, while rocking a child to sleep. Someone asks a question, and another person starts talking. Imagine being one of those children. You've never seen the prairie. You've never crossed the Platte River. You've never watched your parents spend an hour deciding whether the wagon was light enough to ford the next crossing. To you, those stories must have sounded almost unbelievable. You mean there weren't any roads? You slept outside every night? You walked all that way? The children grew up. They told the stories to their children. And little by little, the Oregon Trail became something larger than the journey itself. It became part of the country's imagination. Isn't that fascinating? The trail didn't disappear when the last wagon rolled west. It just changed forms. It became letters tucked into family Bibles, old photographs hanging in the hallway, journal entries, local museums, school lessons, and eventually, a computer game. Now, if you're around my age, there's a great chance the Oregon Trail first appeared on a glowing green computer screen. You'd walk into a computer lab, sit down in front of one of those giant monitors, and there it was. You put your name in, and all of a sudden, you're in charge of a covered wagon, a supply list, and so many decisions to make. Are you going to buy a lot of food? Are you going to load up on ammunition and start blasting during the hunting scenes? How many spare axles seem reasonable? When I was a kid, I didn't know what an axle was. The game did something remarkable. It took one of the most difficult migrations in American history and somehow turned it into something that 10-year-olds could understand. All it takes is one broken axle in that game to learn the importance of an axle. Of course, being 10 years old, we focused on entirely different things. It was always a balancing act, wasn't it? Someone always tried to carry too much. Someone inevitably forgot to buy enough food. And sooner or later, someone died of dysentery. And everybody laughed. Everybody laughed. It's funny how many people of our generation learned that word before we learned almost anything else about the Oregon Trail. And we joked about it. If people say it now, we know exactly what they're alluding to. It's amazing, really. Pop culture infused with American history. It's really cool. I don't know of any other computer game that's had that kind of legacy. It's very cool. We joked about it. We teased each other. We celebrated when someone actually made it to Oregon. I remember in my classroom in fourth grade, when somebody was playing the game, we had one classroom computer and it was somebody's turn to play the game. And when they started getting close, people would crowd around. They'd crowd around that computer. And they'd wait in anticipation. Like I said, we were playing a color version of the game on an old Mac, and that last river that you had to cross, you actually had to navigate it with a mouse. And it was tricky. It was very tricky. And somebody finally made it to Willamette Valley. We all cheered. It was so cool. It was so cool. It was sincere celebration. At the time, I don't think that any of us realized what the game was teaching us. Every decision mattered. You couldn't carry everything that you wanted to carry. You certainly couldn't control the weather. And you couldn't predict every setback. All that you could really do was prepare the best that you knew how. And then you keep moving forward. Now, of course, the game simplified the history. It had to. No computer game could ever recreate what any of those families actually experienced. The endless walking, the uncertainty, the loneliness, the quiet evenings around the fire, the conversations that probably had nothing to do with rivers or mountains. Maybe someone talked about home. Maybe someone wondered what Oregon would actually look like. Again, they were making this trip without ever having seen it. Maybe somebody else complained about sore feet while another person laughed because everybody's feet hurt. History rarely records those conversations, but I have a feeling that they happened every single day. And thinking about that, I had a realization. The Oregon Trail survives today for exactly the same reason the Shanghai tunnels survived. It's like we talked about earlier in the week. For the same reason that people still talk about the Bandage Man on Highway 101. And for the same reason that the Bush House and the Geyser Grand Hotel continue welcoming visitors. It's because people kept telling the story. Each generation found its own way. A handwritten journal, a family photograph, a museum exhibit, a school computer game, maybe a podcast. The details change, but the storytelling continues. And maybe that's been Oregon's story the entire time. Not just rivers or mountains or covered wagons, but people looking at a place and deciding, someone should remember this. After the break, we'll stop for one last campfire before the trail disappears into tomorrow. Because I don't think the Oregon Trail has ever really been about reaching the end. I think it's always been about finding the courage to keep moving forward, when all you can see is the next bend in the road. You're listening to The Midnight Drive. Now, as the fire burned lower, I find myself wondering what the nights actually sounded like. Not an evening after an extremely grueling day, but just an ordinary night. Think about it. The children, they're asleep. The oxen are tethered nearby. Someone's patching a shirt that they'd torn earlier in the afternoon. Somebody else is stirring the last of the coffee over glowing coals. Maybe there's a violin that's playing that made it into somebody's hands. They weren't playing because it was easy, but because music still mattered. I think that's something that history sometimes forgets. It remembers the crossings. It remembers the storms and the hardships. But life has always insisted on making room for ordinary moments. You know, somebody probably laughed around that fire. Somebody told a terrible joke they'd already told a dozen times. Somebody looked up and pointed at a shooting star. Somebody's birthday came and went with little more than an extra biscuit and a smile. Life didn't wait for the journey to end. It unfolded one night at a time. I keep coming back to those maps. Every family carried some version of one. Folded, creased, edges that are worn by months of use. If you unfolded one by the fire, your finger could trace the route that you've already traveled, hundreds of miles behind you. And then your finger would stop. The blank space ahead. Somewhere beyond that blank space, the Willamette Valley. It must have been comforting to know where you were headed. It also must have been humbling to realize how much of the journey still lay between your campfire that night and that distant promise. I've wondered how often people unfolded those maps. Did they do it every night? They only do it after difficult days? Whenever somebody asked, "How much further?" Well, the truth was, nobody knew exactly. They knew the direction. They knew they were going west. But they did not know the day that they'd arrive. I think most of us imagine life working the other way around. We like calendars and schedules, arrival times. The families on the Oregon Trail had almost none of those luxuries. Have you ever thought about calendars, schedules, and arrival and departure times as luxuries? Tomorrow depended only on the weather, only on the rivers, only on the health of the oxen, only whether a wagon wheel survived another rocky stretch of ground. The only certainty was morning. And when morning came, they'd harness the oxen, they'd pack the wagon, they'd stamp out the fire, and keep moving west. In the midst of it all, they worried, they doubted, they grieved, they celebrated, they argued, they laughed, they got tired, they got back up. They simply refused to let uncertainty make the decision for them. Now, earlier this week, we wandered beneath Portland's streets, where history slowly became folklore. We drove a lonely stretch of Highway 101, where stories still ride beside the road after sunset. And we stepped inside the Bush House, where ordinary family life became part of Oregon's history. And we checked into the Geyser Grand Hotel, where generations of travelers left behind quiet traces of their passing. Looking back, I realized every one of those places had something in common. Before there was a tunnel, someone built a city. Before there was a highway, someone walked west. Before there was a historic home, somebody chose to stay. Before there was a grand hotel, somebody believed a town would grow around it. Every story we explored this week began with a decision. Not to know, but to go. And maybe that's why the Oregon Trail still speaks to us. Not because we expect to cross rivers and covered wagons, but because every one of us knows what it's like to stand at the edge of something unfamiliar. Maybe it's a new job. Maybe it's a new town. Maybe it's a difficult conversation, or a chapter of life that begins before we're certain how it will end. Rarely do we get the whole map. Most of the time, we're given exactly what those travelers had. Have you ever thought of life that way? We get a glimpse of the next few miles, and we're given a reason to keep going. And it makes me think of the computer game. As kids, we all celebrated when we finally reached Oregon. The words appeared on the screen. Your journey was over. You won. You made it to Willamette Valley. Real life probably didn't feel like that at all. No music. No congratulations. Just another sunrise. Another wagon stopping beside a patch of open ground. Children climbing down to stretch their legs. Someone looking out across the valley they'd spent months imagining. And then, life. Fields to plant. Homes to build. Neighbors to meet. The trail ended. And living began. As I packed up my notes for tonight's drive, I realized something else that made me smile. This is our 100th episode. 100 nights spent wandering through forgotten places, listening to old stories, and asking questions that rarely have simple answers. If there's one thing that these drives have reminded me, it's that the world is full of remarkable places. Not because they're famous and not because they're haunted, but because people cared enough to tell someone else about them. One conversation, one journal, one photograph, one museum, one computer game, one podcast at a time. The story keeps traveling. And maybe that's the real destination, not the Willamette Valley, not the end of the trail. Just knowing that somewhere beyond the next bend, there's another story waiting for someone willing to slow down long enough to hear it. The fires burned low now. The map has been folded. The wagons stand quietly beneath a sky filled with more stars than anybody bothered to even try to count. Tomorrow morning, someone will tighten a harness, someone will pour the coffee, someone will take one last look toward the western horizon. And then the wheels will begin turning again. Thank you so much, my friends, for taking 100 drives with me. I truly can't wait to see where the next road leads. Until then, keep moving forward, and I'll meet you further on down the road.